All right. Well, let us begin with the one thing. What is the one thing, you ask? There is a book by Gary Keller, an American entrepreneur and best-selling author. Maybe you've seen some other books he's written, but this particular book is called The One Thing, the surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. Pretty big title, but a very simple concept. So in his book, he takes everything down to one thing. And among other things, is he's trying to get us to think about what's that one thing? What does that mean? He tells us a couple of different things. First of all, he breaks down 6 different lies. One, that everything matters equally, that we are actually able to multitask, which might surprise you. Science actually tells us that we really don't multitask, we just task switch between things, and we actually lose time when we're trying to do this thing and then go over to this other thing and come back. That a disciplined life is all that you need to have, that willpower is always on will call, that a balanced life is what it's all about, and that big is bad, which might sound weird when you think about the one thing. But all of this comes down to what's important in life. And he breaks it down to this pyramid. And he says at the bottom of this pyramid, what should be driving everything is your purpose. What's your purpose? Above that should be priority. Notice it's not priorities, not a plural, it's priority. And he goes into how that word became priorities, but we're not going to do that today. Above that becomes the word productivity. So out of your purpose, out of your priority comes your productivity, or the effects of that. And at the very top of this is the word profit. Now, this is a business book, so you can imagine, profit could mean money, but for our purposes and for other purposes, profit could just be whatever you gain or glean or get from all of the above. And these all build on top of each other. And so in order for us to think about building this up, he gives us one question that he calls the focusing question that is supposed to help us narrow down and understand what this one thing is. And it goes like this. What's the one thing I can do that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? I'm going to read that one more time. It's a long question, but I want you to think this through. It's a very powerful question. What's the one thing I can do that by doing it, so by doing that one thing, everything else will become easier or unnecessary? Now he equates this, if you're trying to visualize what he's asking us to do, he equates this to the power of a domino. And we're going to watch a little video to get our brain space into what are we talking about, the power of one domino. So you get the idea. He shows that's a very, very tiny, that's smaller than the average domino, that very first one he used, smaller because he had to use tweezers, to all the way to that 100-pound one that was almost as tall as him, not quite. And he told us what? If I'd had 28, 29, we would have knocked over the Empire State Building. So keep that in mind when we're talking about the power of one thing. See, Gary Keller continues on in this book and he says this: the way to get the most out of your work and your life is to go as small as possible. He also says you have only so much time and energy. So when you spread yourself out, you end up spread thin. You want your achievements to add up, but that actually takes subtraction, not addition. You need to be doing fewer things for more effect instead of doing more things with side effects. Going small is a simple approach to extraordinary results, and it works. I don't know about you, but I have a busy life, and this concept of getting more bang for your buck is very important to me. And I think in a church our size as well, this concept should really be important to us because there's only so few of us. But based off of what he's saying, if we can figure out the one thing that we can be doing, we can make everything else either easier or completely unnecessary. Now he makes a claim in this that this concept does not just apply for business life. He says you can apply this across any area of your life, including the spiritual life. And in fact, if you think about it, this concept is not a new concept. Gary Keller didn't just come up with this. He just happened to put it in some really good words. This concept is actually very biblical. And in fact, if you go back to the Bible with me, in Luke 10, you're going to see Jesus himself understood and used the one thing principle. And this is found in Luke 10, verse 38 to 42. Now keep in mind, Jesus has started his ministry. He's been wandering around, and he's been preaching and healing, as was his custom, and he's headed on his journey somewhere. And it says this, starting in verse 38, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, so they're moving about, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. And she came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister's left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, if you're like me, you've heard this story a number of times. And if you're also like me in personality, you go, oof, I'm Martha. And I admit it. I fully admit it. And so when I hear these words, I'm like, oh, okay, Jesus, couldn't you just soften the blow or something? Like, Martha's trying really hard. And I used to look at this story very much from just that perspective of like, I know that the Lord is loving, so I don't doubt that he probably said this in a very loving way, in a way that spoke to her. I'm not doubting that. But it just seemed like, man, Martha's doing all this work. And Mary's just sitting there at his feet. What is going on here? So let's not get caught up in, is it Mary, is it Martha, who's right, who's wrong here? Let's not get caught up in any of that or get caught up in the emotional, I'm this person or that person, because that's actually not the point of the story. As I've gotten to know this story better, I realize that is not the point that's trying to be made. Now, certainly you can take some things from that. We can be reminded to not be so busy, slow down, etc., and all those different things. But Jesus is trying to make a point, and he uses similar wording to what we just saw Gary Keller say. Now, before we look at that, let's just set this up one more time. So we have Jesus, our Lord and Savior, right there among these two sisters, Martha and Mary. And we know Martha as the doer, and if we were to use the lens that we were using a moment ago, that Gary Keller is telling us about all the things that we're doing and being pulled, what is happening with Martha? She is trying to multitask. She's trying to do all these different things. She's probably preparing a meal. She's probably getting this ready for them. She's running around trying to switch between all these different tasks, and she's getting all worked up, right? And I'm betting too, just knowing the personality type of Martha, she's probably very disciplined. She's probably organized. I doubt she's just scrambling. She's probably, okay, we got this. She's probably done this before. She's got it figured out. And she's doing all this stuff, which is not necessarily bad, right? And then we have Mary, who we don't actually see right away, right? We see Martha running around, being distracted by all these different things, and then we see the only time we see Mary is when Martha comes to complain and says, hey, I'm doing all this work. What is happening here? And yet Jesus actually doesn't even, he addresses it, but he goes, hey, whoa, hold on. It's kind of like the equivalent of those of you who are parents, if your children ever get worked up and for whatever, you almost want to grab my shoulder, slow down, speak to me clearly. I can't understand what you're saying. This is Martha coming to Jesus, and he's grabbing her by the shoulder and saying, stay put for a second. I need you to hear this. This is very important. And he says this to her. Let's read that again in 41 to 42. Calls her by name. He says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about how many things? Many, many things. Her attention is just all over the place. He says, you are worried about many, many things. But only how many things? One thing is needed. Now he does use Mary. He says Mary has chosen what is better and it will not be taken away from her. And we're going to explore that in a minute. But what is he telling you? You're doing all these different things and I just need this one. He's grabbing her by the shoulders and saying, listen here, this is the only point I want you to take away from here is this one point. Mary's got this figured out, I know, but you're going to get it too. He's not leaving her hanging. He's going to let me slow you down here. I want you to hear this. Now the question is then, well, what's the one thing? Because he doesn't say right here, what's the one thing? Let's explore that. So I went to look at various commentaries just to get an idea of how do they look at, interpret what this verse is saying. And we're going to go to BibleStudyTools.com. And they say this about the one thing. They say, the hearing of the word, the gospel of Christ, which Mary was engaged in, and which ordinarily speaking is necessary to the knowledge of Christ, and salvation by him, and to faith in him, which you can see is from Romans. Not that this is the only needful thing, nor does Christ say that there is but one thing needful, but that there is one thing needful. And in case that's too many words and confusing, it's okay. We will continue to clarify that. Matthew Henry's commentary says the following: but oneness is needful in opposition to distraction. We just saw that with Martha. This is in opposition to distraction, focus, attention, as we were saying. There is need of one heart to attend upon the word, not divided and hurried to and fro as Martha's was at this time. One heart, undivided, not hurrying to and fro. That's what Jesus is slowing Martha down from. It's not that what she's doing is wrong or bad. He's going, you are every which way to and fro, completely distracted. And he's stopping her to say, hold on, here's what's really important. The one thing needful is certainly meant of that which Mary made her choice, sitting at Christ's feet to hear his word. So what Matthew Henry adds to the equation is sitting at the feet of Jesus, hearing his word. The Ashbury, which is another commentary, says this story, like that of the Transfiguration, indicates the importance of listening to Jesus and meditating on his words. Discipleship is not merely action, it involves contemplation. Now keep in mind here that he doesn't say that we're never to act on things because we would not do anything if we were never acting on things. He just said it's not made entirely of action. And Martha is like so many of us with being busy, so busy doing the Lord's work. That's what she was doing. Think about that. She's doing work for Jesus. So she could legitimately come and say, Jesus, I'm doing all this work for you. I'm getting your meal ready. I'm doing all this stuff. And yet Jesus is like, whoa, that's good and all, but you're missing the point here. So what is the one thing? Jesus himself explains this further when we look at Luke 4. Now this is earlier in the story. We meet Mary and Martha in Luke 10. So this is before Mary and Martha's story comes. And this is Jesus in the synagogue, very early in his ministry. He's in his hometown. And he's come in, and he is asked to read a scroll. And he grabs a scroll and he quotes the words, well, he reads off the scroll of Isaiah. And he says this, now watch what he's saying about his understanding about his one. What's he there for? What's he doing? Watch what he says. And these are the words of Isaiah that he's pulling up again. He says this: the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim, watch for that word, good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of the sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now there's multiple things that are going on in there, but there's one word that he keeps repeating, and that is the word proclaim. Over and over he's going, I'm here to proclaim. What's he here to proclaim? The good news. He's here to proclaim what? Recovery, that there is redemption. He's here to proclaim what? Freedom. His one word, if you will, at that point is to proclaim. Jesus understood this to be his mission. This is my one thing. Building on, as we saw earlier, purpose, priority, productivity, profit. And what we see here is that it worked. We see the exact domino effect that you just saw a moment ago with Jesus being our starting domino. And if you're not sure, we're going to do a little timeline to take a look at how this one domino took over the entire world. It's going to be a very abbreviated history, because if I were to do all the dominoes, we'd be here for a long time. But here's what we know. Jesus, 27 to 30 AD in ministry. So we have his ministry and his death. And at that time, he has roughly 12 disciples. And I say roughly because there were other people with him and stuff like that. But we're going to use 12 for the sake of this numbering. So he has 12 disciples plus some other people. By the time of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit descends on them, and they've got a room full of people, so we know they had more than 12 even then, how many people are baptized that first day? 3,000 people are baptized. Okay, so we went from Jesus, 12, 3,000 plus already. That's not in a very long time frame either. These dominoes are moving quickly. We go further on and we see that Paul's journey as he goes out to the Gentiles with the help of other people around him, it's not just Paul and the church are doing this, and they get the gospel out to the Gentiles, to the then known world. I don't know what the number is on that, but let's just think that this is a huge number by comparison. This is beyond the 3,000 that we saw. We have now gone to the then known world. And it doesn't stop there. We go through time. And yes, as we saw earlier, which was actually very helpful, Lineage gave us that time frame. And there is a dark ages, but underneath that dark ages, the light is still growing. The Waldenses, the Irish Church, there's all these different, God is still working underneath this. But we see this burst out again in the Reformation. You guys have heard and seen about the Reformation. At the time of Reformation, John Wycliffe's kind of the precursor of that. We see the flame is not extinguished and the light just goes poof, out into the world, and suddenly people are getting the Bible into their hands and all the printing presses out and things are getting out and people are learning more about God, and it's growing and growing and growing and growing. To present day, yes, there's many more dominoes between this. To present day, we have 2.38 billion Christians globally. Now you may ask me, well, are these active Christians or whatever? I'm not sure exactly, but that's the people that are professing on our planet. But let's just think about this. We went from Jesus, 1 and 12 disciples, to 2.38 billion Christians today. And that is currently living. That's not counting over the entire history of the world. That number would be much bigger. And if we think about the world's population, that's still kind of a tiny number. But for the purposes of what we're thinking about with the dominoes, that is a huge number. And how did they do this, right? They did this by understanding the principle that Gary Keller brings out in the book. They understood their one thing, and their one thing was this: the good news, or the gospel. Their one thing was to tell about Jesus. That was the one thing that they were doing that by everything else became easier and or unnecessary. The gospel message. And so we see that question. The one thing that I can do by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary. Now, granted, you might say, for some of the folks, you look and go, was it actually easier? It's not saying that the Christian walk is easy. I'm not saying that. But what we do know is that once people are on that walk and they're committed, nobody goes back and says, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I hadn't been connected, because the path is easier, if you will, with Christ on your side. So remember that we were talking about those layers. If the purpose is the one thing, what should the priority be? And here's some things that we know about the people that were with Jesus and spreading this word. They were, because of their one thing, spreading the gospel, their priority was connecting with Jesus, sharing Jesus, living in Jesus. And we're going to explore this in further detail over the next several months as I'll be preaching with 3 people who understood that one thing and understood where to begin. We'll be talking about, in an upcoming sermon, Peter, Paul, and maybe a name you're not as familiar with, Priscilla. So I'm going to end with this one quote, and some of you saw this last week if you were here. And I think it's very important, and this is what the series name is taken from. It's the last part of this quote by Mother Teresa. And she says this: "Yesterday is gone. Tomorrow has not yet come. We only have today. Let us begin." So let us begin, folks, with what's your one thing.